Good evening. What a crowd. Thank you for all getting here at rush hour on a Friday. Really appreciate it. I hear things are sort of crazy around town. I don't know what's going on tonight. Welcome to tonight's program that's a part of Cap Times Idea Fest 2024. You probably know it by now if you've been here, but I am Paul Fanlin of the Capital Times and thrilled to see you all here. It means so much to us. Thank you. I've been looking forward all summer to our first session tonight titled Midwestern Politics and the Future of American Democracy. We started talking with tonight's guest about this session being part of Idea Fest way back in March. But the topic has only grown in relevance in the months since, as we seem to be the epicenter of the political universe these days. A couple of quick announcements. Our host, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is committed to freedom of speech and freedom of expression as an essential part of the education mission. It's our expectation that you will allow the speaker's presentation to occur without disruption. Any disruptions to the event will be handled swiftly by security. And I'd also like to just mention we'd ask you to silence your phones and refrain from flash photography. Okay, on to the program. I imagine everyone here knows that Wisconsin and Minnesota have long been considered political bellwethers as well as historic cradles of progressivism. But has that landscape changed, and how has it changed? Columbia University Professor Sam Freedman is author of a new book about Hubert Humphrey and his leadership on civil rights in the 1940s. He'll be joined by Dan Kaufman, author of a history about the recent era of Wisconsin, was the Republican Party's increased influence or dominance even with the election of Scott Walker. And they'll be talking about the state of progressivism here and where it might be headed. Our panelists tonight both have local connections. Sam is a 1977 UW-Madison graduate. We're talking downstairs, coming from the East Coast. And as I said, he's now a Columbia professor. His most recent book that I referred to is titled Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights, and it focuses on Humphrey's pivotal role in getting the Democratic Convention in 1948 to fully endorse civil rights for the first time. That breakthrough set the stage not only for Harry Truman's upset victory over Thomas Dewey, but for the major civil rights laws that LBJ and Humphrey pushed through in the 1960s, and we're now on the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. Sam has been friends over the years with Dan, the author of The Fall of Wisconsin. I imagine many of you have read it, a deep dive into the dominance of Walker with the about, I guess, 13, 14 years ago now. Dan grew up in Madison as a faculty kid. Actually, we were talking downstairs, our neighbor, we were essentially neighbors. Our backyards almost touched. He was gone before I got there, but small world. And he's spent a lot of time back in the state working on his book and articles for the New Yorker and the New York Times, and you'll see his byline there, and he's terrific. The icing on tonight's cake is that our moderator is Dan Balls, who is chief correspondent for the Washington Post and has been a wonderful part of Idea Fest before. Dan has been covering national politics since 1978 and is a Freeport, Illinois native. He's a rock star in the world of national political journalism, having chronicled through exhaustive reporting the many waves of America's political change over the decades. Dan has written 3 highly acclaimed books about political trends. So with no further ado, would you please welcome Dan, and Sam to the stage of Idea Fest.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's great to see you, knowing that there's an alternative venue that has a lot of people in it tonight. We're thrilled that you chose to come here, us talk about Midwestern politics. So thank you very much. The title of this session underscores, obviously, the central importance that this region plays in presidential politics. And when we talk about the electoral map, the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are absolutely crucial And now that Penn State's in the Big Ten, we can consider Pennsylvania a Midwestern state. Although, I don't know, we may not talk a lot about Pennsylvania tonight. I want to get to the current moment a little bit later in the evening, but there's so much rich history about Midwestern politics that I want to try to kind of set the stage for where we are at this point. And we've got, as Paul said, we've got two fabulous guides. Sam's book on the young Hubert Humphrey is it's a wonderful read. If you haven't read it, please do. I suspect that many or most of you have already read Dan's book, which has been out a number of years, but it's also a terrific book, as Paul said, a very deep dive into what has happened to this state in the last decade and a half, with some history before that. So welcome to you both. Now, we were talking backstage. They were together in Brooklyn talking about Midwestern politics just a few nights ago. And the beauty of tonight is that there will not be any need for simultaneous translation. Everybody here, I assume, is a native Midwestern speaker, and so you don't have to worry about that. So let's look back a ways. And Sam, let me start with you. And the basic question: what prompted you to write about the young Hubert Humphrey and that era of Midwestern politics?
I felt like there were two gaps that my book could fill. If people knew anything about Humphrey these days, they knew about the disgraced, ridiculed latter part of his public life, supporting the Vietnam War, being handed the nomination in 1968 against the backdrop of the police riot, running as the establishment candidate for the nomination against George McGovern. And all that's true, and the critique is well-founded. But there was a gap about this incredibly valiant period in Humphrey's life, particularly in the 1940s, that, as Paul's saying, anticipates the civil rights victories in Congress in the 60s, but a period when Humphrey was one of a handful of Caucasians really fully committed to equality for Black Americans and also the fight against anti-Semitism. And the other gap I wanted the book to fill was in the civil rights narrative itself, because in a well-intentioned way, a lot of people situate the beginning of the modern civil rights movement in the mid-50s. They think about Brown versus Board of Ed, decision in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, and then move forward through the Freedom Rides and the March on Washington and so forth. And again, all that is accurate, but it omits this incredible decade of activism in the 1940s against the backdrop of the global war against fascism, really catalyzed by the sacrifice of Black GIs who went into that war with a slogan they called Double V, victory over fascism abroad and then victory over Jim Crow at home. So I thought this book could fill in both of those gaps.
So when you think about Hubert Humphrey and where he came from and how he grew up and where he grew up, set him in the context of, in a sense, sort of agrarian populism from the late 19th century. How were his own political views formed from that background?
That's a great question. And I think Humphrey is really instructive about something we're grappling with now as a country, which is kind of the positive side of populism and the very toxic side of populism. It's this Janus-faced political philosophy. So Humphrey grows up in a tiny little town 250 miles west of the Twin Cities, Dolan, South Dakota. And his father is one of the handful of Democrats and liberals in the town and is a great admirer, for instance, of William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan is the epitome of a certain period of prairie progressivism and was terrific on economic issues and fighting monopolies and so forth. And Humphrey is imbued with those better parts of Bryan, as well as through his father, the internationalism of Woodrow Wilson. But a key thing is that Humphrey, very much following kind of his father's model, his father was a supporter of Al Smith, who as a Catholic was deeply unpopular in Protestant South Dakota, where Humphrey grew up. Humphrey pretty early on can separate out the communitarian spirit, the economic egalitarianism of prairie populism, but he never gets sucked into its underbelly, the nativism, the anti-Catholicism, the anti-Semitism, the racism, a suspiciousness, a fear of outsiders and difference, you know, a nostalgic look to a previous America in a way we still are living with now. And so Humphrey was then well prepared, without even realizing it, for what became a pivotal year in his life, which is his first time out of the upper Midwest, when he goes to graduate school at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge in the 1939-40 academic year. He does a one-year master's program, but that's his immersion into Jim Crow. And it really alters his whole understanding of political lives and political issues. And out of that experience, he creates this fusion of the economic concerns of what had been prairie populism and ultimately becomes the New Deal, but also the necessity of directly confronting different forms of discrimination.
Dan, let's move to you. Your book is essentially about the Scott Walker takeover of Wisconsin and the implications and the fallout from that. But you do also set it against the longer history of progressivism in Wisconsin. And could you walk us through that? I mean, what is that history that was undone by the Walker election and what happened after that? Sure.
There were like two major strains of Wisconsin progressivism, which sort of emerged with the waves of immigration from Scandinavia, first in like following the Civil War. A lot of Scandinavian immigrants came here, and they brought with them a kind of communitarian ethos. They settled in rural areas, particularly Norwegians in the western part of the state. They formed the first agricultural cooperatives. There were a lot of Finnish miners in the northern part of the state. They were very receptive and active in the trade union movement. And then there was, and that movement was galvanized by Bob La Follette, who was first a congressman and governor and then senator. And La Follette grew up on a farm in Dane County, and he was really backed by these Norwegian farmers. And a big influence on him was a man named Edward G. Ryan, who was the Chief Justice of the state of Wisconsin. And there was a law in the 1870s in which the state had tried to impose restrictions on the railroads that were gouging farmers. It was part of this broad movement called the Grange across the Midwest, where these, basically these farmers were being ripped off, exploited, and they began electing people and pushing for political change. And they managed to pass this law called the Potter's Law, which established a railroad commission and other reforms to limit the power of the railroads. The railroads took it to court, to the Supreme Court, and Ryan upheld it. Pretty quickly afterwards, they got rid of the governor and repealed the law. But Ryan gave a famous address at the University of Wisconsin Law School in which he warned against corporate power controlling people's lives. I think I can almost quote it. It's, he said something like, there will come a time in your day, the question will arise in your day whether we will be a society ruled by patriotic free men or the feudal serfs of corporate capital. And this made an incredible impression on Bob La Follette, a young Bob La Follette. The other major figure for him was a guy named John Bascom, who was the chancellor here and was sort of part of the social gospel movement and believed that if society got too unequal, there would be a discord. He wanted to harmonize society, and part of that was a kind of economic equality. Rich people should never be too rich, and the poor should never be too poor. He also had a tremendous faith in public institutions, and the University of Wisconsin, of course, was the jewel in the crown, but it was also the state schools, the rural schools, and a lot of that was this ethos of the Scandinavian immigrants. They brought with them this incredible faith and belief in public institutions. The other strand of it happened in Milwaukee, where there was this giant wave of German immigrants, a lot of them fleeing this failed revolution in 1848. Many of them were liberals or even radicals, and they coalesced around this movement called the Turners. There's a Turner Hall in Madison where we used to see punk rock shows. But in Milwaukee, it was a center for this political agitation, and they formed really the most successful reformist socialist party in the United States. They elected a congressman, Victor Berger. They had socialist mayors in Milwaukee for 40 of 60 years, up to 1960. And that movement was sort of derided by East Coast socialists. They called it sewer socialism because it was very pragmatic. It was what I'd call an idealistic pragmatism. And those two kind of strands coalesced at the beginning of the turn of the 20th century. La Follette, there was a famous legislative session in 1910. It was probably the most progressive legislature in American history, and it pioneered the workers' compensation, conservation laws, many other reforms, child labor laws, to make society better. And this whole movement really went on to influence the New Deal. In fact, some people said that the New Deal was basically Bob La Follette's 1924 presidential platform writ large. The author of the Social Security Act was the University of Wisconsin Professor Edwin Woody, and there was a tremendous meeting between the university and the state government that was called the Wisconsin idea, and it was a sort of pragmatic progressive reform. The idea was that the university should serve the citizens of the state. There was a kind of moral component. And that's kind of the early history, and it had tremendous national influence. Medicare was basically authored by a Wisconsinite named Wilbur Cohen under this tradition, so it lasted a long time. It was a sort of homegrown social democratic movement.
But as Sam alluded to, there was another side to some of this, and La Follette in particular was an isolationist, was he not?
I think
and his son certainly had that.
He opposed the First World War, and he was censored for that. A lot of people, he was isolationist in that. I think that was a position that was widely held by a lot of working class left-leaning adherents, that it wasn't a war that the United States had a real interest in. That he almost got expelled from the Senate for that. I suppose he didn't have the dark side like Humphrey. He was not nativist. He was pretty progressive for his time on civil rights and women's issues. His wife, Belle, was an incredible feminist and deeply influenced him. But I think around the First World War, yes, he didn't want the United States to be involved.
Yeah, Sam, when you look at these two states in particular, Wisconsin and Minnesota, how do you differentiate them politically? I mean, they're both liberal in many ways, but there's a conservative strain in Wisconsin politics, certainly, as we've seen recently, and with Joe McCarthy. Minnesota has been consistently more liberal. I mean, if you think of the politicians that we're familiar with from Minnesota, they are, for the most part, quite progressive and liberal. How do you think about these two states and the differences between them?
Well, I think you put your finger on part of it right away. There's always been a kind of a schizophrenia in the Wisconsin political decision-making, that you would go from Joe McCarthy to Proxmire. You have Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson in the Senate simultaneously. And there's been, I think, a deeper reservoir here of support for some ideas on the right than has traditionally been the case in Minnesota. It could be that just because, in terms of population, the Twin Cities, and if you add in Rochester and Duluth, those three cities, which are all relatively liberal places, comprise a huge percentage of the statewide vote. And even no longer, not in the Trump era, but up until the Trump era, one of the big outstate areas, as they call it in Minnesota, the Iron Range, where there also were these very radical Finn miners, that had been one of the Democratic strongholds for many years too. And I think another piece of it, even though my book is partly about what Humphrey did, surprisingly, in Minneapolis, a place that people don't associate with civil rights. But I think that issues around race playing on that kind of third rail politically hasn't been traditionally as effective in Minnesota as maybe it's been here. I always think about the fact that George Wallace won the Wisconsin primary in, was it 68 or 72? And yet again, another one of the Wisconsin whipsaws, Jesse Jackson, wins the Wisconsin primary in 88. And in Minnesota, once in the late 1940s, the Farmer Labor Party, which was further to the left, and the Democratic Party, which was a big city traditional machine, get your Thanksgiving turkey, get your patronage job. Once they merged, which Humphrey was a big part of, then there was a very solid electoral majority for liberal candidates, and that's why you can sort of trace the stream from Paul Wellstone, just looking at that Senate seat, on up to the present day. You can look at governors. Even the Republicans tended overall to be quite moderate.
Yeah. Certainly this region, and if you think of these states and then Iowa and the Dakotas, there's been a tremendous evolution over the last 30 years. I mean, when you think of who used to represent South Dakota and North Dakota in the Congress, they were progressives, and they're all gone. And, you know, in Iowa, you know, there was Tom Harkin and Chuck Grassley, but, you know, sort of the Ron Johnson and Tammy Baldwin of Iowa. But Harkin's gone, and there's nothing that has replaced him. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution that this region has gone through. And Dan just published a very fine piece in the New York Times Magazine about NAFTA and, in a sense, the deindustrialization of the Midwest. As Paul said, I grew up in northern Illinois in a town called Freeport, which when I grew up had, you know, quite a number of small manufacturing operations. They're basically all gone. Dan, talk about NAFTA and what has happened and the implication for the politics of this region.
Sure. And I think just to add one thing to what Sam said, I think Wisconsin has always probably been a little bit more reliant on industrial jobs than Minnesota, with the exception of the Iron Range. And that process of deindustrialization, I would argue, has affected the politics here. NAFTA was part of a long 50-year process of deindustrialization. It began before, probably in the mid to late 70s. I always trace it to the late 70s. In Youngstown, Ohio, there was Youngstown Sheet and Tube, one of the big steel companies, when suddenly announced that they were laying off 5,000 people. It's a day that's called Black Monday there, and it's similar to like when Kennedy was assassinated. People actually remember where they were when they heard this news. And it set off a wave of deindustrialization across the country, exacerbated by Paul Volcker at the Fed, who raised interest rates. But then, and this process was ongoing, but NAFTA came along, and it had been really a Republican idea. Ronald Reagan first promoted a North American free trade agreement in the late 70s, and George H.W. Bush took it up, negotiated this treaty. And I don't know if people remember the 1992 presidential campaign, but it was really heavily focused on NAFTA. You had Bush and Clinton, and then Ross Perot, who really, that was the centerpiece of his campaign, was opposition to it. He famously said there'll be a great sucking sound of American jobs. And he won 19% of the vote, which was the highest third-party share since Teddy Roosevelt. Clinton took a kind of middle position in this and said, you know, I'll support it, but with side agreements protecting labor and environmental rights. Organized labor was very much opposed to it. They saw it as a race to the bottom. Basically, a company could pay a Mexican worker $1 or less versus an American wage, including benefits and so on. Clinton manages to pass it. The media is very supportive of it, but he has to overcome the majority of his party in Congress, both in the Senate and in the House. Particularly in the House, there was a really fierce battle, but he eventually prevailed, and almost immediately the Democrats lost 54 seats that year. For the first time in 40 years, they lost the majority of the House. And there's been studies that have shown that counties that were exposed, particularly exposed to NAFTA job losses, have shifted to the right. You can see Ohio, too. I mean, that state, Barack Obama won twice. It's been really hollowed out, Michigan. And, you know, what NAFTA was for a lot of people and was also an attack on labor. In fact, one woman in Milwaukee, when I was reporting that piece, basically described it as union busting. And it further accelerated a massive wave of deindustrialization. Milwaukee had been an industrial powerhouse, probably second only to Detroit per capita. It was in the 50s, 60% of the population worked in these industrial jobs, heavily unionized. It was also a bastion of relative working class African American prosperity. And in the early 70s, it had the second highest median income for black Americans, partly because they were heavily represented in these union jobs. That has decimated the city. Now it's got the second highest poverty rate. It has one of the highest racial disparities. It's the most segregated city, or the second most. And it's really left, I think, altered the politics of working class Americans, not just white working class Americans. You can see it basically, in my view, created a pathway to the rise of right-wing populism. Trump in 2016 campaigned heavily in Wisconsin against NAFTA across the Midwest. And that resonated. You know, Hillary Clinton famously didn't campaign here. She was also tied heavily to her husband's NAFTA policy and support for China's admittance to the WTO, which cost, by most accounts, like 4 million jobs. And she also supported these agreements. And I think this NAFTA period, which also included China's admittance, but the permanent normal trade relations and the repeal of Glass-Steagall, represented a kind of realignment of the Democratic Party, at least part of it, away from its working class New Deal roots. And that is still kind of being played out. And Biden has moved back from that significantly in many ways, but the process is still ongoing. You heard Trump and Vance both criticize NAFTA in their speech, and it's central to this idea. At the same time, it was nothing really but false promises. Nothing really changed. They're continuing to lose jobs to Mexico, even though Trump renegotiated NAFTA with a few modest improvements. So it's this force that and it isn't clear where it's landing. And it's one reason why I think these elections are still so close and so heavily determined by the Rust Belt's swings back and forth.
Sam, pick up on this, the deindustrialization of this region and what the implications have been for the politics.
Well, I completely agree with Dan's take on it, and I just want to say that, as he was saying, this has had a really long arc. Let me leave the geographical Midwest for a moment, but in terms of the demography I'm going to talk about, it could be in the Midwest. In the early 80s, I was the Connecticut reporter for the New York Times, and I would frequently go up into the river valleys in northern Connecticut to places like Torrington and Naugatuck and Saugatuck and Waterbury, all of which had had major factory closings already. I did a lot of factory layoff stories. I did stories about the attempt of the member of Congress from there on the Democratic Party, Toby Moffett, to push through plant closing legislation. And it couldn't get a hearing, not only from Republicans, but from many Democrats as well. And this was, again, late 70s, early 80s. I was reading a really important book then called The Deindustrialization of America by Barry Bluestone and Bennett Harrison. They were ringing the alarm on this stuff in the 70s. And you could see it happening, and it's continued to happen. And I think also there's material elements which Dan really laid out, and there's also the psychology of if you feel abandoned by the party that you saw it represented you, and you may be harsher as a voter in judging those who you thought were your ally, who you feel betrayed you, versus those who you never expected a lot from to begin with. And I think that's part, perhaps, of the psychology of the voting. And I just want to add a couple of things from Humphrey's life that really resonate with what Dan said. Hubert Humphrey was a great coalition builder, starting as mayor of Minneapolis and on up through the Senate and as vice president, but particularly when he was building his political career, a couple of his most vital allies were people out of organized labor. Walter Reuther from the United Auto Workers, A. Philip Randolph from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and it connected Humphrey through them to masses of working class voters of both colors. And I think if you think of the CIO unions, the UAW, the steel workers, the machinists, these were also unions that messaged very effectively from the top down that we support civil rights, this is important for our rank and file, we don't go in for divisiveness along racial or religious lines on the factory floor. And I think that that doesn't mean you're going to change anyone's private opinion, and it doesn't mean that someone may actually not at the same time object to a black person buying a home on their block, but it meant that in aspects of public life, it was not acceptable to act on certain baser motives. And I think that's where union leadership was so important. And as it's been hatcheted down to, what, 6% now of the private workforce, that's one of the things that has been lost along the way.
The arrival of Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016 and talking about these issues, it really does mark a sea change in the way the whole country, and particularly a lot of people in the Democratic Party elite, think about these issues today. I mean, he forced a turn. In 2016, there were roughly 100 counties spread across the country that had voted at least 4 previous elections for Democrats, and in some cases, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 times, that flipped to Trump. Almost half of those are in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them kind of hug the Mississippi. There is a rural element to this, and I would like to get you both to talk about both in the context of the deindustrialization, but also the message of Trump to people in these rural areas and how the rural areas have changed. I mean, we're talking about agrarian populism of the 19th century, and today we're talking about rural areas that are basically out of reach for a Democratic candidate. What's happened?
I think I wrote a story about the crisis affecting Wisconsin family dairy farmers. Dairy was sort of the last person standing of the family farm. And I think there were, it's basically been decimated now. I think there's about 6,000 or so dairy farms left in the state. After the Second World War, there was 150,000. And everywhere I would go when I was reporting the story, somebody would tell me, oh, in this valley, just 30 years ago, there was 30 farms. Now there's 1. So I think one of the biggest issues is the monopolization of agriculture and the monopolization of rural life in general, whether it's the Walmart that has wiped out the small stores on Main Street, or the the big pesticide company, and so on and so forth. And a wonderful agricultural economist named John Eichert talked to me about how rural people are left with this legacy of this toxic legacy, corporate farming, and so on. Now you have, it used to be, in the 40s, you could make a living with 20 cows. Now there's dairy farms with 5,000 cows, and it's like somebody described it to me. A Republican legislator, actually, who's an organic dairy farmer, said, it's like a hamster on a wheel. You're always having to produce more and more. And I think that economic picture is missing. It's definitely a cultural thing as well, but it's rooted in a deep economic malaise. Some of the towns in western Wisconsin are not dissimilar. My wife's family is from Gary, Indiana. From Gary, I mean, just completely hollowed out on a smaller scale. And the loss of that rural cohesion, and now you have a lot of rural schools that have been closing in Wisconsin. The school is the center of these communities, and when people would tell me, like, when the school goes, that's it, we're dead. And I think you're left with a lot of anger and bitterness, and people don't know where to put it. The Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign, a wonderful state legislator, Republican state legislator, Dale Schultz, told me, he lived in Richland Center, he said, I'd never seen anything like it. It just caught fire with people. These are Republican areas. I mean, somewhat mixed, but still fairly Republican. And there was this revival, a little bit of this old La Follette type of a more inclusive economic populism. And when that dissipated, a lot of that energy went into Trump.
Just picking up on some of what Dan said, if you go out these days to Dolan, South Dakota, where Humphrey grew up, as I did a number of times in my research, the wheat fields and now the soy fields, they're still lush, and they roll on and on and on. So agricultural product is still being grown there in great volume. But Dolan, which had 600 people when Humphrey was growing up there in the 1920s, now has 200. It's desolated. Its tiny little main street only has 1 or 2 working stores. And we see that story throughout the upper Midwest and the grain belt, the depopulation. And some of it tragically is brought on, also as Dan was saying, the superstore that comes and totally undermines Main Street, and people think this is good, their prices are lower at Walmart, while at the same time what they're doing is destroying the small businesses. I had a student at Columbia Journalism School years ago who'd grown up in Hastings, Minnesota, about 25, 30 miles outside of Minneapolis, and that was the book project he was working on, is what had happened to Main Street, and a number of things had, but the biggest one was Walmart. But there's also always been this duality to small-town populism, a way in which you could appeal to its better angels, and a way in which you could appeal to suspicion and resentment and looking for somebody to blame. And it was there in Bryan's day, and it was the kind of thing that people like Gerald L.K. Smith and Father Coughlin played to in the 30s, and George Wallace played to it, and Trump has been more effective than anyone in playing to it. And I think it ties it in with a couple of other trends. One is that there's been so much depopulation that if you looked, I'd be interested to know of those counties that had voted Democratic 4 or 5 or 6 times in a row and then switched to Republican, what has their total population been? Because I think what you have is a brain drain, people leaving those places, going to bigger cities, going to a place like Madison, because they see the opportunities there, and that leaves behind people who have lost social capital, who feel ever more isolated and, you know, ever more vulnerable out of really sincere distress. I want to emphasize that the distress is real as it gets, but are set up to look for someone or something to blame.
There's another aspect to this that I wanted to get you both to respond to, and that is that certainly the cultural issue overlay has also been a divisive part of our politics, and that has divided urban and rural. I mean, Kathy Kramer, who's a professor here, wrote a very fine book a number of years ago called The Politics of Resentment, which in some ways, you know, as with your book, it talked about Scott Walker, but it also kind of predicted, even though it came out at the same time, predicted the rise of Donald Trump. In what ways, as you both have studied this, in what ways have Democrats misplayed those issues to make it possible for Trump to really tap into votes in those areas?
I would say, well, it was interesting. When I was reporting the book, a lot of people were critical of the previous governor, Jim Doyle, a Democrat, who had boasted that he had cut the state workforce more than any governor in previous, and it was a context of austerity. It was being promoted by the Obama administration. It was, and I think that is the context in which Scott Walker was able to achieve Act 10 and the passage of a right-to-work law. There was a lot of, especially in rural areas, and Kathy talks about this, you know, the teacher might be one of the only people that even has a pension or health insurance that isn't, you know, that isn't paid for themselves. And it's very easy to gin up resentment, I think, in a context of economic scarcity, especially when the other side, and to get to your question, Dan, I think they were also complicit in it to a different degree, but one of the labor leaders in my book that I quote, he called Walker son of Doyle, because there was this context that the public sector, we needed to cut it. The university was a drain. There was no, it was an abandonment of those sort of kind of deeply rooted Wisconsin support for public institutions. And Walker seized on that, and he famously said to his, many people here will remember it, his most important donor at the time was Diane Hendricks, this billionaire building magnate, and she asked him when Wisconsin would become a right-to-work law state, and he said, well, first we're going to go after the public employees because you use divide and conquer, and that was his term. And I think that was very effective because people in a lot of other places were hurting, jealous maybe, because they were working so hard that somebody might have it a bit better off. Kathy talks a lot about how are these teachers even able to protest? I'm working all the time. And I think in that context, it's very easy, and Trump took it writ large, and it's very easy when people are struggling to blame somebody else, blame an immigrant, or so on and so forth. And I think the Democrats had abandoned those kinds of more core universalist working class programs that were helping them. In fact, even Obama talked about, a grand bargain over Social Security. And without an effective opposition, I feel like it's easy for right-wing populism to fill the void.
Right. What I always say about effective demagogues is they have the right diagnosis but the wrong medicine. And so that goes right to that point. And I'll make a few observations, Dan, that I think are on the borderline between culture and economics or materialism. One is that one of the grievous mistakes the Democrats and liberals made was to begin to treat organized labor as just another special interest. And if I think back to the coverage and the discourse, even in many Democratic circles and liberal circles around NAFTA, when a lot of labor unions were, again, sounding the alarm, it was treated as, well, they're upset because they're going to lose some members and their dues will go down. They weren't credited with people who lived in communities and had a very tactile sense of what was going to be immediately destabilized in those communities. And I think it's really taken to the Biden administration to fully welcome organized labor, which had shrunken down greatly in the intervening years, but to really welcome back in as participants and not be treated as you're just another special interest group and we have to balance you against all the others. So I think that's one factor. Another is to use a term that often comes from parts of the left, this phrase about you want to be seen or you want to be heard. I think that's very powerful psychologically, and part of the dark arts that Trump practices is, in spite of being born into staggering wealth and having nothing in common with working people, he does in some way convey to them the sense that he sees them. And I think a lot of Democratic politicians have struggled to do that. I think it's beginning to change. I think Biden was really effective at that because it was who he really was. Well, that's why his stories from Scranton, particularly in 2020, had traction. And I think it's part of the reason for the phenomenon of Tim Walz, that why people, on one hand, believe me, having roots in the Midwest but living in the East Coast, part of me rolls my eyes at the exoticization of Tim Walz, seriously, in the coastal media. But, and by the way, and of course, they all don't know what Minnesota nice is. I see so many stories thinking like nice means nice. It's like, you don't understand, folks. This is passive aggressive. I got to be at Columbia J School. I sometimes say,
as I said, everybody's
explainer,
a native speaker here.
But Tim Walz, but the real things, out of a small town, Army Reserve, tiny little state college campus out in the sandhills of Nebraska, high school teacher, all of that is registering with people, eating too much food at the state fair, being able to fix a carburetor, and because it's not put on. And if I think of other Democratic politicians around the country who've been able to make these connections, whether it's Tim Ryan when he was in the House from Ohio, or Sherrod Brown, or some of these rising stars like an incredible teacher who's a state legislator in Missouri named Jess Piper. These people are able to make those around them feel seen and understood. And I don't know the formula for that, but I think that's the missing sense of being seen has been destructive.
When I did interviewing after the 2016 election up through the Midwest, one of the words I heard consistently from people who were backing Trump was this sense of being disrespected, and as you say, not seen. That their views were were not taken seriously. They were not taken seriously. They were written off. You mentioned Governor Walz. I interviewed him as part of this project that I did because he survived 2016, although that section of Minnesota went very strongly for Trump. So he said, when Democrats ask me what happened, I say, what you should ask is how I survived this thing. And I said I had a populist message on job training, renewable energy, farm bill, farm country, all of those things. And so there were nearly 40,000 people who voted for President Trump and for me. These are people who aren't confused about their politics. They're looking for something to get done. And he was able to do that. Dan, this state, I think in large part because of what happened with Scott Walker, has become kind of the laboratory of the divisive, toxic, deep division politics. Was he the forerunner of what has become the country as a whole at this point?
I did make that case that he sort of paved the way for Trump. I mean, of course, there's a long history in American politics of divide and conquer, especially around race and so on. But yeah, I really feel like he paved the way. One thing he understood, too, was the attack on labor was also a political attack. I mean, for example, in Act 10, you were allowed to make a donation, tax-free, even after, to the United Way, but not to your union. He saw it as a pillar of strength for the Democratic Party, and he, of course, cleaved off the police, some police, and most firemen, largely because they supported him. So I think, yeah, that divide and conquer, that was the original title of my book, actually. But somebody said it sounded like an early 80s hardcore song. I think it was somebody at my publisher. So we settled on something else. But I do think he paved the way for Trump. And in fact, Grover Norquist said in 2017, Act 10 was so important to Trump's victory, and if they were able to replicate that in a dozen states, it would spell the end of the Democratic Party. Obviously, he's prone to hyperbole, but there was some truth to it, and I think Walker saw labor as a foundational and structural thing, and the Democratic Party didn't anymore, and that was embodied by Barack Obama not coming to support the protests, even though it was the largest labor uprising in decades, half a century, and avoiding deliberately campaigning during a recall election against Scott Walker, where they had gathered 1 million signatures. Tom Barrett, who had lost to him 2 years before, ran again, and Obama was campaigning right nearby, and made a deliberate choice not to make an appearance. And I think, that divide and conquer is very effective when there's no counterweight, and that's what's happened. And, as Sam said, it's been changing somewhat, and I think it's an open question whether it's changed quickly enough or whether it's too little, too late.
Too little, too late?
I don't think it's too little, too late, but like any big boat, it takes a while to turn it around. And it also is going to require additional economic thinking as well, that the industries that have already fled, it's going to be hard to bring those same industries back. there's going to need to be, and I think Biden has made a good start on this, really wise industrial policy that's going to think of what the future good-paying, unionized, don't need a college diploma jobs will be, to begin to fill in the vast gaps from industries that have offshored already and aren't coming back. Because again, we're talking about a really, really long process. There's a terrific book called Molly's Job that came out probably in the mid-90s. If it came out after NAFTA, it was just very shortly after. And it started with a woman named Molly who works in a factory in Paterson, New Jersey. And first that company flees to the right-to-work state and the lower wages of South Carolina. And it follows the person who has that job there. And then the company takes it to a maquiladora in Mexico, and that person in South Carolina is left bereft. And when I was telling Dan about it the other day, he said, and probably since the book came out, the company went from Mexico to Vietnam in this race to the bottom. So I don't think you're going to bring back all of those companies. The question is, what industrial policy can bring other types of jobs here? What can you do to really vastly improve vocational education in this country? So you're preparing the kids who aren't going to go to college for jobs that will exist. Pass the PRO Act in Congress to try to give unions some tools to organize again. I think those are some of the elements, and also something Tim Walz did in Minnesota, wipe out the requirement of a college diploma for many of the jobs in the public sector. So none of those is going to be an all-purpose solution, but I think they all have pieces of a positive change there.
So it's been how many years since Scott Walker? 14 years since he was elected. Donald Trump has been on the scene for 9 years. The title of this panel is the Midwest and the Future of American Democracy. So in our closing few minutes, I'd like to get each of you to address that question. We have gone through now a long period in which the politics have been fairly well defined by all the things we've been talking about. What is the future of American democracy, and where does the Midwest fit into that?
I think the Midwest is ground zero and will remain so. It's interesting because this continuity that you described, Dan, I do agree with that. And I think there's some tendency for a lot of focus on Trump as an individual, the outrageous behavior and so on. Eventually, he will depart the scene through natural law. But I think the open question is what will happen with Trumpism. And I think that is where a deeper political reckoning has to be. And I think its foundation is a more equitable society economically. Is it sustainable that Elon Musk or people have $200 billion and the people that I documented at the Masterlock plant are now scrambling, working 2 jobs? You know, it's just become so extreme. And when you pull back and see that, it doesn't seem like a very sustainable model. And it seems like a model in which a right-wing populist, you know, somebody with dictatorial aspirations would flourish. So I think that question of Trumpism, which I think goes back a long ways, and I'll just say one other thing. You know, there's been a general, I don't think Trump in some ways is all that different. There's a lot of focus on Project 2025. And during his presidency, a lot of these people were very powerful. You know, in 2016, I went to a conference of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which had a big role in Wisconsin in terms of changing. It's basically a model bill factory for the states. And who was there but Mike Pence and Stephen Moore, who Trump was going to nominate, the right-wing economist for the Club for Growth, who Trump was going to nominate to the Federal Reserve. And they were there to reassure the state legislators that were there, that Trump was in fact one of them. His apostasies around Social Security, protecting it, and Medicare were just rhetoric, really. And so that infrastructure, the conservative infrastructure that has been building since the early 70s when the Heritage Foundation was founded, Jane Mayer documented it brilliantly in her book, Dark Money, which I encourage everyone to read, is still there and more powerful than ever. Project 2025 is now the center of this campaign. And, you know, despite Trump and Vance's disavowals, Trump was at a heritage event saying, they've created a blueprint for me. So I think those are the continuities, these sort of structural continuities that I think are the most important questions, I guess, around the future of American politics.
I agree with your question. I think that the Midwestern states are going to be some of the states, not the only states, but some of the states that are going to be essential in this really existential battle for American democracy. We have to remember that things are never fixed in stone. 15 years ago, people wouldn't have thought of Georgia or Arizona or Nevada as being swing states either, and people would have thought of Ohio being a swing state. So nothing stays fixed, but I think that certainly if you think about Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they give every sign of remaining keystones to whichever party is going to win. And we've talked mostly, and not inaccurately, about working class Midwesterners who are either white or who are American-born blacks. But it's important to also realize how much the demography of these states are changing. And this is, again, sort of an East Coast misapprehension that I'm always pushing back on, which is that these aren't just these white bread states. The calumnies against the Haitian immigrants who are in Springfield, Ohio, gets at a truth, which is that places that had not had recent waves of immigration, especially non-white immigration, are having it now, and often it's key to them thriving. And if you think up in Minnesota, the Somalis, the Hmongs, the Eritreans, the Liberians, those are all populations that need to be brought into the political structure, and also to feel like there's something that liberalism and the Democratic Party has to offer them. In the New Deal and the pre-New Deal era, sometimes with idealism and sometimes just with here's the garbage can for your alley and here's your nephew's job in the Parks Department, the waves of Jewish and Italian and Irish and Greek and Polish immigrants were brought in to the political system and brought in ultimately to this gigantic democratic coalition. And that's going to have to be assiduously done for these recent populations. If you look at the struggle the Democrats have had hanging on to what's called the Tejano, third or fourth generation Mexican Americans in South Texas, it shows what happens when you just assume that because someone isn't Caucasian, they're going to be liberal or Democratic forever. So I think that's going to be a key part of the battle. And the last thing I'll say is that for liberalism and the Democratic Party to be viable in states that have big rural areas, you have to make a point of running candidates for every office in every cycle. You can't, I think, you can't think that you can let legislative seats go unchallenged. Library boards, school boards, we've seen what happens when when you have a 10% voter turnout, a mobilized minority wins seats. But you can't let all of those seats go unchallenged and then expect that you're going to get a decent turnout in these rural and small town areas when you want it for the Senate election or the presidential election. Voting is a muscle, and we have to give people the reason to keep the muscle in tune in off-year elections, not just the big-ticket ones in presidential years.
We are at the end of our hour. I want to thank Sam and Dan for a really interesting conversation, and I want to thank all of you for being a great audience. And with that, we will say good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Dave. Pleasure.